Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would talk about this little subject and kind of put my 2 cents in to this topic that a lot of people, of course, seem to be talking about, especially ever since this fight ended up happening. And of course, of course, for those of you that did not pay attention to the past weekend or the last weekend of the big boxing fight that ended up happening, or what should have been somewhat of a big boxing fight, because there wasn't really much of a fight. But of course, between that of Mr. AJ Anthony Joshua, who at one point in time was looked at as the debatable best heavyweight on the planet within that of boxing, of course, versus that of Mr. Daniel Dynamite Dubois, who, of course, at one point in time in his career, was undefeated and looked to be the next big thing in that of boxing, potentially even the next AJ Anthony Joshua. Then, of course, his career was kind of halted by that of the Joe Joyce stoppage loss in his career. And then, of course, after that, the loss to Mr. Alexander Usyk. And it just goes to show you that it's very interesting how certain careers end up within that of the sport of boxing. But a certain amount of people are now asking the question about Mr. AJ Anthony Joshua because he was expected to win this fight by the majority of people. And even though I did not put my fight prediction out there, I also would have predicted AJ Anthony Joshua to beat that of Daniel Dubois. I expected a better version of AJ Anthony Joshua. And in this fight, I do think that he showed a lot of the faults that he's always kind of had within his style. I don't think that he's ever changed his head levels very well. I don't think he's ever moved his head off the center line very well. He can be hurt to a certain degree, but I'm not going to state that he's as chinny as what people state. I think that, he probably has about, I'll say, a B minus level chin, in my personal view. Because to be fair to Mr. AJ Anthony Joshua, and this is a statistic that most people are actually not going to put out there. But AJ Anthony Joshua, even though this is the second time that he's been stopped in his career, AJ Anthony Joshua was usually always able to beat the count. To be fair to the man, when he was against Mr. Andrew Ruiz, the man was able to beat the count, and it was the referee's decision to stop the fight. Now, of course, a lot of people believe that AJ Anthony Joshua ended up quitting in that first Andrew Ruiz fight. That's up to you. But at the end of the day, AJ Anthony Joshua has shown a lot of heart. He's shown a lot of toughness. He's shown a lot of grit within that of the past of boxing. But the question is about Mr. AJ Anthony Joshua at this current moment in time is that, first of all, is he done as a fighter? And secondly, where was Anthony Joshua in terms of being quote unquote overrated or underrated as a fighter? And where does he really rank in terms of the greats or in terms of some of the greater heavyweight level champions within that of the history of the sport? And a certain amount of people may ask, is AJ Anthony Joshua the most overrated heavyweight fighter of this generation? Or is he the most overrated fighter of this generation? Well, if you ask me personally about who is the most overrated heavyweight of this generation, in my view, it is not that of AJ Anthony Joshua. The real answer to that question, just personally, in my view, is that of Mr. Deontay the Bronze Bomber Wilder. And that's not me trying to insult him. That's not me trying to state that Deontay Wilder did not accomplish great things. But one thing that I will state between the difference of AJ Anthony Joshua and Deontay Wilder is this. When you take a look at AJ Anthony Joshua's career, you can state whatever you want to about him. You can state the Andrew Ruiz loss. You can state about how he got outboxed by Alexander Usyk. You can state, of course, how he performed absolutely, absolutely tragically against that of Danny Dubois. You can state all these things. But the thing is about AJ Anthony Joshua is that, at least for his generation, he might have the best heavyweight resume out of any other fighter, even including that of a debatable Alexander Usyk and a Tyson Fury. Or, I'm not going to go as far to state Alexander Usyk because Usyk was able to beat AJ Anthony Joshua when he was still an A-grade level fighter and looked at as a very dangerous champion. And actually, I believe the favorite in the Alexander Usyk fight. And he also was able to defeat that of a Tyson Fury, although a bit older, and maybe someone that suffered a little bit of wear and tear from the Wilder fights. Who knows? But the thing is that he was able to beat Fury when Fury also was the favorite. So Alexander Usyk deserves a certain amount of credit, and he has to be ranked up there in terms of probably the greatest cruiserweight of all time, and certainly the greatest cruiserweight that was ever as successful at the heavyweight division. And in my view, he does have to be above that of Evander Holyfield after what he has accomplished. But the thing is about AJ Anthony Joshua, and we really want to go there. AJ Anthony Joshua has accomplished quite a bit in his career. I do think that his skill set, once again, has always been a little bit flawed. But when you do take a look at his resume, the man does have a lot of A-grade wins for that weight class. Whereas comparative with that of a Deontay Wilder really only has one confirmed A-grade level win in his career, at least in my personal view, and that's against Louis King Kong Ortiz. I don't think that any of the other wins in Deontay Wilder's career would really be classified as A-grade. I mean, maybe if you wanted to count Bermain Stavern, maybe, because of course at one point in time he was a champion, but to be quite honest with you, Bermain Stavern kind of won the belt when to win. It wasn't really that much competition. It's no offense, but that generation, before it was ended in the Vladimir Klitschko era, before it was ended by when Tyson Fury ended up defeating that of a Vladimir Klitschko, I believe all the way back in 2014 or 15, that was probably one of the weaker eras in terms of heavyweights that I can personally remember. When you take a look at this heavyweight generation, you don't have to state that all these fighters were as gifted or as skilled or as talented, maybe as what, someone like a Muhammad Ali was, or maybe like someone like a Lennox Lewis was, but everyone to a degree is a product of their environment and their generation. And when you talk about this era, it certainly, in my view, was a decent amount more competitive than what the Vladimir Klitschko era was. Because to be quite honest with you, unless you completely lived through the time of Vladimir Klitschko and just watched every single one of his fights, can you really name 5 notable opponents on his resume just off the top of your head? I mean, of course, the man has, Alexander Povetkin, he has David Haye, he has, I believe Samuel Peters is on there as well. He has some other fighters on there as well. But Vladimir Klitschko, he was possibly a part of the weakest generation of the heavyweight division that I've personally ever seen, at least debatably. And he's still an all-time great heavyweight in my view. But I don't really know exactly how to rank him. But once again, the thing is about AJ Anthony Joshua, one thing that I'll give him, at least for his generation, the man has Alexander Povetkin when he still was looked at as a relative A-grade level fighter. He beat Joseph Parker when Joseph Parker, I believe, was the IBF champion and undefeated as a fighter. He defeated Dillian Whyte when Dillian Whyte was not a champion, but when Dillian Whyte, of course, was undefeated as a fighter and up and coming. He defeated that of a Charles Martin when Charles Martin was a champion, who in my view was never really an A-grade level fighter, but at the end of the day, Charles Martin, he ended up winning a belt, I believe, because his opponent in that fight, in that title fight, ended up pretty much having a collapsed knee overall within that fight, a torn ACL or something like that, But anyways, and AJ Anthony Joshua, he has a multitude of other great wins as well. Even though Klitschko was older in that fight, he still was probably about an A-minus level fighter. It was fight of the year, and AJ Anthony Joshua showed a lot of grit from coming up in that fight and having to regain conditioning and stamina in order to beat that of a Vladimir Klitschko. And of course, there's some other wins that I'm probably not, remembering. The Andrew Ruiz rematch, of course. Andrew Ruiz, one of the greater heavyweights of his era. And there's some other ones that I'm personally not remembering. And that's not even bringing up some of the B-grade level wins that AJ Anthony Joshua ended up getting in his career, like that of a Kubrat Pulev or Jermaine Franklin, or, like that, of some of the other fighters that perhaps I'm not thinking of. But at the end of the day, AJ Anthony Joshua, in terms of being quote-unquote overrated or underrated, well, it depends on where you rank him. But what I personally say that AJ Anthony Joshua was ever quote-unquote overrated in his career, it depends on what you're talking about. Maybe in terms of his skill set, maybe to a certain degree, because once again, AJ Anthony Joshua has never been a super duper elite, level fighter in terms of his skill set. Now, for the heavyweight division, he still was an elite level fighter because AJ Anthony Joshua, at one point in time, he held 3 of the 4 main belts in his career. He is a 2-time world heavyweight champion. And at the end of the day, once again, the man did get a certain amount of great wins. But a lot of the faults here that I've seen with AJ Anthony Joshua, they've always been there. But to be quite honest with you, in this fight against that of a Daniel Dubois, I don't think that I've ever seen Anthony Joshua look as bad as what he personally did within this fight. I mean, literally every boxing basic that certain boxers or certain people that are participating within the sport, certain things that they should never do, Anthony Joshua pretty much did them. And Chris Algieri, I believe, when he was talking about this, with Paulie Malignaggi and Timothy Bradley, he was mentioning this as well, that Anthony Joshua, that you can clearly see that there's a little bit, of a depreciation in terms of his skill set. And some people may say, Paulie Malignaggi, he stated that it was more the mindset and that AJ Anthony Joshua isn't hungry anymore. Well, I personally don't buy that excuse, just in my personal view. I think that AJ Anthony Joshua still was a little bit hungry, but what I will state is this. I believe that he probably had underestimated Danny Dubois. Looking into this fight, it looked like AJ Anthony Joshua was smelling his own fumes a little bit, And I think that he thought that he had Danny Dubois a little bit intimidated, and that Danny Dubois' prior resume of being a quote-unquote quitter against that of an Alexander Usyk and also against that of a Joe Joyce, I think that he thought overall that eventually that Danny Dubois pretty much was going to be a cupcake in some of those rounds, and that he would catch him eventually with a very good swift shot, and that he would eventually get him to quit, in my personal view. So when Danny Dubois ended up coming out in the first round against a clearly unprepared Anthony Joshua, at least for a fight against Danny Dubois to where he was going to press on the fight of that matter, AJ Anthony Joshua was not prepared whatsoever. He just wasn't prepared whatsoever. And to be honest with you, I've never seen AJ Anthony Joshua look as bad once again as what he did within this fight. Now, some of the faults, once again, that we've seen within this fight, I've always seen within AJ. Like I said, he's never had great head movement. He's never been a guy that's changed levels very well. He's a guy that that sometimes needs to spring on the action a little bit more than what he does relying on his counter-punching ability, which is what he should have did with Alexander Usyk. But talking about Alexander Usyk, just in my personal view, why do I believe that AJ Anthony Joshua does not look like quite the same fighter, at least in my personal view? A lot of people, of course, they'll point to Andy Ruiz or they'll point to some other things, but personally, in my view, I think that Alexander Usyk is pretty much the answer to this equation. Sometimes when you fight an elite level boxer, which Alexander Usyk is. Alexander Usyk is not just an elite level boxer. He's one of the greatest boxers of all time. And he's now proved that, after his Tyson Fury and AJ Anthony Joshua. And Alexander Usyk, when you take a look at a complete level boxer, he pretty much, at least in terms of the basics, does pretty much everything that you would want him to do. Really, the only main weakness that I would see with Alexander Usyk is that he does not defend to the body super well. Maybe you could state that he could be a little bit better on the back foot. But to be quite honest with you, he appears to be relatively good on the back foot as well. Alexander Usyk is an all-time great level fighter, and not only is he an all-time great level fighter, he's one of the most skilled fighters that you could possibly see, basically no matter, the situation, no matter the equation. Alexander Usyk is always changing levels. He's always moving. He's always trying to parry. He is always changing levels. He is always trying to get his jab in there, and he's always trying to attack you from different angles, and he's always moving. And I think that when AJ Anthony Joshua got in the ring against Alexander Usyk, he had never seen something like that before. And a lot of people, of course, once again, they'll take a look at it and say, well, why was AJ Anthony Joshua debatably able to beat Andrew Ruiz in that of the rematch? And you had some of these channels like Dante and Aki TV hoping that AJ was going to beat Usyk within that of the rematch, because even though they were rooting against AJ Anthony Joshua at first to protect their boy Deontay Wilder, they knew that if Alexander Usyk, that if he ended up winning against AJ, their worst nightmare was going to come, which is that two Caucasian heavyweights were going to be the two best of that era, in Tyson Fury and that of Alexander Usyk. It really could have not ended up much more worse for that of the LDBC and new media. So when it came down to it overall, once again, Alexander Usyk, he ended up defeating that of AJ Anthony Joshua, and a certain amount of people, they were wondering as to why AJ could not defeat Usyk in the rematch, but why he could defeat Andrew Ruiz. And I can tell you a very simple answer for that is because Alexander Usyk is on a complete whole other level than that of Andrew Ruiz. Andrew Ruiz is a great fighter, but at the end of the day, Andrew Ruiz does have certain limitations. First of all, one of his limitations is his own hubris and arrogance. And a lot of the times we've seen that, within certain fights, he clearly gained 20 pounds of lard within that rematch against AJ Anthony Joshua. It was all within his stomach and his man tits when it came down to it overall. Once again, and he clearly overall was not in the best of shape, and he's never really been in super duper elite level shape, but it was very clear that, he let his arrogance get the best of him in that AJ Anthony Joshua fight. And on top of that, Andrew Ruiz, he's only about 6'3" to 6'4". He's not super tall for that heavyweight division, at least not in the era of giants, when you have certain guys like AJ Anthony Joshua and Danny Dubois and Wilder and Tyson Fury and other guys like that. He's not a super giant guy, and on top of that, Andrew Ruiz's feet are very, very slow. He does not cut off the ring very well. Sometimes he can be a bit too flat-footed, and he does not cut off the ring very well. That's a part of the reason why he ended up losing to Joseph Parker, even though that was a fight that could have went either way. But Andrew Ruiz, a part of the reason why he lost that fight is because Andrew Ruiz has very, very slow feet. And that's really basically his main limitation. And there are certain other fighters that have that limitation as well, especially Mexican fighters. Like Canelo, even to a degree, has that to a certain view. But even Canelo has faster feet than that of an Andrew Ruiz. And at least Canelo Alvarez has kind of found a way a little bit to adapt around that because he has such great upper body movement and great shoulder rolls and, great slipping ability and being able to back out and parry the punches. Canelo Alvarez has found a way to basically adapt, even with some of his limitations. Andrew Ruiz, once again, when you compare him to that of a Alexander Usyk, Andrew Ruiz is very similar to that of a crocodile, to where a crocodile is an extremely dangerous animal. It's one of the biggest, it's one of the most dangerous apex predators on the planet. But a crocodile has more limitations, say, than another apex predator like that, say, of a grizzly bear or like that of the Bengal tiger. A Bengal tiger is very agile, and it's very agile basically in whatever element you put it in. A tiger can be agile, and it can be very adaptable. It can be very dangerous in that of a tree. It can be very dangerous in the water. It can be very dangerous on land if it's chasing you in the meadow. At the end of the day, that's what Alexander Usyk is. Alexander Usyk is a tiger. He's a grizzly bear. He's someone that can adapt to certain situations, and he is dangerous within a multitude of ways and situations. He is not someone that's just going to be dangerous in one or two areas. Andrew Ruiz, once again, he's like a crocodile. He's very dangerous, but he's only usually dangerous if you allow him to catch you. He's only dangerous in certain waters. Once you start to get more to shallow water, once you start once again, to get a little bit beyond his reach, he really doesn't know what to do. So that's kind of the difference between there. And I do believe that Alexander Usyk, with his elite level boxing ability, I think that more than likely messed up Anthony Joshua more than what the Andrew Ruiz loss ever did, because first of all, I think that AJ Anthony Joshua heavily underestimated Andrew Ruiz in the first match. I think it was very clear that he was not in quite the same shape as what he was when it came down to it. And what I'll also tell you is this. I think that there's a very big possibility that AJ Anthony Joshua, that he also was not in the best of shape within this fight. And maybe Danny Dubois. Of course, Danny Dubois is a very hard puncher. But the first punch that he landed, I mean, AJ Anthony Joshua was very lucky that was at the end of the round, because to be quite honest with you, it looked like had that fight went on for about another 20 seconds that AJ Anthony Joshua would have been stopped. I mean, I've seen even other punches land on AJ Anthony Joshua and them not quite really have that effect on him. The only other punch that I remember that had that effect on AJ Anthony Joshua, at least within one single hit, especially that early on in the fight, was against that of a Vladimir Klitschko. When Vladimir Klitschko ended up knocking him down with a good right hand, I thought that there was a potential chance that Vladimir Klitschko was going to knock out AJ Anthony Joshua. He looked very hurt, but of course, to his credit, he was able to get back up, take it, with a little bit of grit. And of course, he was able to come back and get the knockout and the victory. But at the end of the day, AJ, to be quite honest with you, I'm almost wondering if he did heavily underestimate Danny Dubois. And there's even certain hints of that AJ Anthony Joshua kind of stated. And I do think, once again, that he did underestimate Danny Dubois, just in my personal view, because almost everything that I've seen within this fight, AJ Anthony Joshua was doing almost everything wrong. Not only was he not moving his head or changing levels, which, he's never really been great at doing that anyway, but he was defending the completely wrong way. When Danny Dubois threw that overhand right, he put both hands away from his face in order to try and parry the punch. And of course, certain boxers, they do that. Like we've seen Edgar Berlanga, do that against Canelo Alvarez recently, where Canelo set him up with a great left hook in the third round and ended up knocking him on his ass. But for anyone who knows boxing, or for anyone that's trained in it, or for anyone overall that knows some of the basics, you're never supposed to pretty much put both hands away from your face, especially when your opponent is coming in with a haymaker or really coming in within range. You have to at least keep one of your hands up, and AJ Anthony Joshua should have kept his hands up. He at the very least overall, should have kept his, right hand up, or potentially, his left hand up, because the right was coming in. But to be honest with you, the best thing to do there was probably to keep both hands up, try to change levels and move downwards. Not only did AJ Anthony Joshua pull both hands away from his face, he didn't change levels whatsoever. And AJ Anthony Joshua, once again, he's never been great at that. But at least in the past, I've seen AJ Anthony Joshua, change levels to a certain degree. I didn't see any of that within this fight. I mean, literally from the get-go, Danny Dubois, pretty much every punch that he wanted to land, landed on that of AJ Anthony Joshua. And once again, in that fifth round when the knockout finally happened, AJ, of course, hurt Danny Dubois very badly, because I think that he hit him with the right hand. And AJ Anthony Joshua, it was very apparent that he believed that if he didn't get Danny Dubois out of there, that he was not going to get him out of there at all, at least at that moment, that he was going to have to get him out of there at that moment. And if he didn't do it, then he was not going to win the fight. That's what AJ Anthony Joshua, in my view, believed. And what further proves that to me, at least in my personal view, is that AJ Anthony Joshua, when he finally threw, that uppercut, that stupid ass uppercut that he threw, you're never supposed to throw an uppercut overall from that long range or that far out when your opponent overall can throw a straight right down the pipe, because once again, for anyone that knows boxing, you're never supposed to throw a looping punch, or a straight punch is always mainly going to beat a looping punch. Those are the main basics of boxing. AJ Anthony Joshua had both hands down, and of course he came in there with the right uppercut, and of course he got hit with a straight punch right to the jaw, and he was not able to recover whatsoever from that knockdown. AJ Anthony Joshua, just an awful performance mainly. But once again, to talk about quote unquote being overrated. Well, the thing is where do you really potentially rank that of a Mr. Anthony Joshua? And that's really a good question about where does he really potentially rank in terms of the greatest heavyweights of all time? Is AJ Anthony Joshua, is he a Muhammad Ali, is he a Lennox Lewis or a Rocky Marciano? No, he's not any of those guys in my view. He's probably not a top 10 heavyweight of all time, but if we were to have discussions about AJ Anthony Joshua, at least debatably, being within that of the top 20 heavyweights of all time, or certainly at least within the top 25, I could potentially see it, because at the end of the day, he did defend a certain amount of his titles. He ended up almost completely becoming unified within that weight class. And for his era, he did win a lot of the bigger A grade level fights in his career. He didn't win every one. Once again, he lost the first Andrew Ruiz fight, but he did avenge that fight. Of course, he lost to Alexander Usyk, but Usyk has to be looked at on a completely different level now than what he formerly was. Usyk right now probably has to be within that conversation of the top, 20 to 30 fighters of all time. He's certainly right there with Evander Holyfield, if not above Evander Holyfield in my personal view. He probably is above Evander Holyfield now, especially after that victory of what he got over Tyson Fury. I mean, purely just phenomenal. But, anyways, when it comes down to it, and of course, Anthony Joshua, he recently just lost to that of Danny Dubois. Now, the question is about Mr. AJ Anthony Joshua also as well at this point, is AJ Anthony Joshua done as a fighter? Should he retire? Well, certain people would quote unquote disagree about AJ Anthony Joshua retiring. Some people may believe that he just needs to get, back in the ring and, maybe not underestimate his opponent quite as much this time, at least to my personal view. And that AJ Anthony Joshua, that he can somewhat come back just like he did against Ruiz and just like he did against that of an Alexander Usyk. Let me tell you what, this is just my personal view of it, and I've already kind of stated this. I don't think that AJ Anthony Joshua has been the same fighter ever since he lost to Alexander Usyk. To be honest with you, the last time that I seen AJ Anthony Joshua, at least against an A-grade level fighter, to where he was relatively comfortable in the ring or looked somewhat like his old self, was against Alexander Usyk in the first match. And after that, you could start to see that Anthony Joshua realized that Alexander Usyk, that he was just a little bit too much for him in terms of the skill set. It just is what it is, and he was a little bit too much for him. AJ Anthony Joshua, in my view, fought the complete wrong fight. Now, he tried to fight more of the right fight in the rematch, but the skill set was clearly just so disparate between the two of them, to the point overall to where AJ Anthony Joshua, he just wasn't going to defeat that of an Alexander Usyk. He just wasn't going to. And I don't think that he looked very good in the rematch. I do believe that he won some rounds against Alexander Usyk, but I still had Alexander Usyk at least winning that fight 8 rounds to 4, just in my personal view. And ever since then, against Robert Elenius and that of a Jermaine Franklin, he never really quite looked the same, at least in my personal view. Now, of course, against Aldo Valin, he looked pretty good, but we really don't know how good Aldo Valin is. I mean, of course, he gave a very tough fight to that, I believe, of, a Tyson Fury, and beat Dominic Man Titty Brazil. But I mean, Dominic Brazil, no offense against him, but Dominic Brazil was never really a guy that was really a top level heavyweight. Just is what it is. The only people that stated that he was the people that were really sticking up for Deontay Wilder, fighting his bums of the month. Is what it is. And once again, that's not me to disrespect Deontay Wilder. But once again, when people talk about the quote unquote most overrated heavyweight of this era, in my view, it's not AJ Anthony Joshua, it's Deontay Wilder. And I say that once again, to not disrespect Deontay Wilder in any sort of way, which of course seems impossible when I state that statement. Deontay Wilder, in my view, does deserve a spot in the Hall of Fame. He did have 10 title defenses, and he's a guy, once again, that did become the American WBC heavyweight champion. But at the end of the day, no one's really going to take a look at Deontay Wilder's career, later on, 20 years later on down the line, and take a look at his title defenses and say, wow, can you believe that he defeated Dominic Brazil and Chris Arreola and Johan Duapis and Bermain Stavern and all these other, like, no one cares. It is what it is. What people are going to pay attention to is the Tyson Fury fights. They're going to pay attention to the Joseph Parker fight and the Luis Ortiz fights. Those are the fights that they're going to talk about. They're not going to talk about any of those other bums that Deontay Wilder ended up defeating. It just is what it is. But that being stated, Deontay, in my view, at one time was a top 20 pound for pound fighter. AJ, in my personal view, one time on my list, he was top 10 pound for pound. Actually, at the time when Usyk ended up defeating AJ Anthony Joshua, I believe that I had him within my top 10 pound for pound list. And one time, in my personal view, you could debate that AJ Anthony Joshua was a top 10 pound for pound fighter. So once again, when we talk about where is AJ Anthony Joshua now, well, I think that AJ Anthony Joshua more than likely should call it a career. And certain people may potentially disagree with me. But AJ Anthony Joshua in that last fight, he suffered so much damage. And not only did he suffer so much damage, but I don't think that AJ Anthony Joshua, especially after this fight, I don't think that he's ever going to be the same fighter ever again. To be quite honest with you, AJ, once again, he lacked almost every basic fundamental within that fight. And AJ has shown, and fighters have just shown in general, that, once, they kind of lose, especially to an all-time grade level boxer, they're never mentally the same again. And not only are they never mentally the same again, but skillful wise, they're never the same again either, because it affects their mentality so much, because they wonder what they're doing wrong, because they don't see the skill level, they don't see the game on the same level as what a Floyd Mayweather does, or what a Alexander Usyk does, or what a Canelo Alvarez does, or what a Terrence Bud Crawford does, or whoever the hell else you want to put up there, Manny Pacquiao. Does. They don't see the game like that. When you're talking about fighters like that, you're talking about the best of the best of the best of the best. Those are very, very, very rare fighters that come around once every generation. AJ Anthony Joshua is not one of those fighters. He's a relatively great fighter for his generation, but he's not a guy that has a severe boxing level IQ. He just never has. Alexander Usyk is a guy that has an extremely high level boxing IQ. And the only other heavyweight really of that era that also has a pretty high level boxing IQ is that of a Tyson Fury. Even though, of course, he has certain lapses in judgment, which is why he ended up getting knocked down against Deontay Wilder at times, and on top of that, lost to Alexander Usyk. But when it came down to, once again, AJ and Deontay, they were still relatively great for their generation. Are they going to be remembered as top 10 heavyweights of all time? No, probably not. But for both of them, it's probably more than likely about time to call it a career. Now, of course, the fight that a lot of people would want to see is out of the AJ Anthony Joshua versus Deontay Wilder fight. And personally, I wouldn't mind seeing that fight either. Because if that fight ends up happening, it's going to be, a great show about who potentially overall, could win that fight. I think, of course, before this Danny Dubois fight, people would have favored AJ to knock out Deontay Wilder probably within about 5 or 6 rounds. But after taking a look at this fight, I'm not really quite sure who would be the favorite in that fight. It may even be Wilder. Because Wilder, even though, of course, he got stopped in his last fight against that of a Big Bang Zhang, Zhang, I believe his name is. AJ Anthony Joshua got stopped very bad against Danny Dubois, and to be honest, once Danny Dubois really started backing him up, he had no comfort level whatsoever. That fight still could be 50-50. That's a very intriguing fight, but I just don't see that happening. In my personal view, AJ, I don't know if I'm ever going to see him on the championship level again. I would like to see him, someone on the championship level again, because I'm always happy to see someone come back in their career, and also give a lot of credit to Mr. Daniel Dynamite Dubois. Someone overall that, of course, someone, of course, that was looked at as a quote-unquote quitter, and he did somewhat quit in the Joe Joyce and the Alexander Usyk fights. But once again, I'm not really going to go after him too much, because Joe Joyce gave him a broken orbital eye bone. I can never judge a man overall for ending a fight when he has a broken orbital eye bone. That is a serious and severe injury that not only is very painful, but something that could really, really affect you in the long term. I don't ever criticize at least someone too heavily for quitting in that type of fashion. And against Alexander Usyk, I think that he also knew that he had enough. And Danny Dubois was looked at pretty much as more of a hype job at that point in time, and someone that really, was pretty much, more left behind, and someone that was more of a facade than what he was in reality. But of course, in his last 3 fights, he's gotten, at least 3 stoppage victories, all being upsets. One of those fights, of course, being against Jarrell Big Baby Fat Ass Miller. 320 pound, fat ass Jarrell Big Baby Miller. where he ended up getting the stoppage in the 10th or the 12th round, I believe. Then the next one against the former undefeated Filip Pergovic, somewhat of an amateur sensation, the Croatian sensation. And then, of course, he was just able to get the biggest victory of his career against Mr. AJ Anthony Joshua. He was not favored in any one of those fights, and he certainly wasn't favored against AJ Anthony Joshua. So a big credit to Mr. Danny Dubois. Not necessarily because I believe that he's the most skilled fighter that I've ever seen, and not because I believe that he's going to beat that of a Usyk or a Tyson Fury, but at the end of the day, big congratulations, because it does go to show you that it's never too late to turn around things that you want to turn around or become a better version of yourself or still be successful. Even when we take certain losses or even when we take certain hardships, there's always the possibility to where we can get back up and still become successful. And I have to give Danny Dubois a lot of credit for that. As Alexander Usyk said to him a couple years ago, you're very young and you still have a great chance overall to become a champion within the sport of boxing. And of course, eventually he did. And now he defended his title against that of an AJ Anthony Joshua. So of course, Danny Dubois, big credit to him. We'll see who Mr. Danny Dubois fights next and how long he's going to hold on to those titles. We'll have to see what he does. It's going to be very particularly interesting. I'm not quite sure. And he has gotten a little bit better as a fighter. But as for Mr. AJ Anthony Joshua, if he does fight somebody next, I would like to see him against someone that probably would be more than likely within the top 15 and not quite the top 10. Maybe even a Filip Pergovic. That would be a fight that, might help him out a little bit. A tough fight, but someone that is coming off of a loss. Maybe someone else, maybe a Gerard Big Baby Miller. That could be a fight that could be a little bit, tougher. But that's probably not the best fight either, because Gerard Big Baby Miller, even though in my view he's not extraordinarily skilled, he's a guy that's skilled enough and he puts on such immense pressure that that might not be the best fight for AJ Anthony Joshua. AJ is going to need more of a soft touch if he gets back in the ring. And do I believe that him fighting Daniel Dubois in an immediate rematch is a good decision? No, personally, I do not. I think that that's a terrible decision. I think that he more than likely would get stopped again, at least at this current moment in time, or lose very badly. But we'll see what happens. AJ, in my view, is going to need a few more soft touches. And, of course, there's Deontay Wilder, but I just don't see that fight happening, at least not right now. But we'll see what happens. We'll see. Could be very particularly interesting. But that's pretty much about it for today. And as for the question of, do I believe that AJ Anthony Joshua was overrated? Well, he certainly wasn't the most overrated heavyweight of his time. In my view, that was Mr. Deontay Wilder. But when you talk about AJ Anthony Joshua, about being quote-unquote overrated, it depends on where you rank him. But in terms of AJ Anthony Joshua, in terms of comparing him to some of the other greats, in terms of heavyweights, at the end of the day, AJ probably does have to be remembered as one of the greater heavyweights. Not someone that necessarily has to be within your top 10 or maybe even top 15 heavyweights of all time. But the thing is that, when we do take a look at it, what really separates AJ Anthony Joshua that much from certain heavyweights, like, maybe that of Riddick Bowe, someone that was a very great heavyweight, of course, for his day, but other than Evander Holyfield, we really don't know how many of the big wins he would have gotten in his career. There's a couple of other guys, that perhaps maybe I'm not mentioning, that would be looked at as relatively great for the heavyweight division. What really separates Anthony Joshua that much from some of those other guys? He certainly could maybe fit in within the top 15 to top 20 heavyweights of all time, certainly for sure. So we'll see what ends up happening with Mr. AJ Anthony Joshua. I do hope to see him return maybe to a possible championship level. I just don't think that's going to happen. I think that AJ more than likely is pretty much done. And he pretty much showed a major depreciation of his skill set and serious lack of boxing IQ within this fight. And AJ, once again, has never been the most smartest, the sharpest tool in the shed when it comes to boxing ability. But this is the worst that I've ever personally seen him. And if he looked this bad in this fight, if someone ends up putting him in a similar situation, what Anthony Joshua has proven is that more than likely that you cannot rely on him, at least in terms of his boxing IQ. So once again, we'll see what ends up happening. But I'm going to be interested to see what happens next. But I just thought that I would talk about that, put my 2 cents in. Very interesting conversation. But that's pretty much about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. And we'll see where Mr. Dano Dynamite Dubois goes as well. But that's pretty much about it for today. Thank you.